your old stomping grounds, New England Patriots. Bill Belichick has hired his old buddy, Bill O'Brien, who recently was the offensive coordinator for Alabama the past couple of seasons here. But this is what we've talked about in terms of alignment and New England going back to the well with a guy that already understands what goes on in that building and how they see the game of football. What do you make of Bill O'Brien now going back to Foxborough?
I think it's, when I was working at CBS, Femi, I was, I got fired from the Eagles after the draft, after we drafted Trey Thomas, Jeremiah Trotter, Allen Rossum, Ike Reese, a bunch of guys that went on, Brandon Whiting. I got fired after that draft for Tom Modrak. He came in as the GM and fired me. So I'm out of work. And CBS is just getting football back. So somebody tells me, you should go talk to CBS. Maybe they'll hire you as like an insider. You can do that. There were no jobs in the league, really. So they hire me as an insider. I'm not supposed to be on the air. And so I'm feeding George Seifert, Brent Jones, and Marcus Allen, along with Jim Nantz. Those four people are on the set, and I'm feeding them information about what's going on in the league, talking to different people, yada, yada, yada. Mm-hmm. So, George is just a really good guy, but he's not a TV personality. So about midway through the year, they put me on the air. They make me the insider. And then they turn around, and George is kind of really bored, and he's going to get the Carolina job, so he leaves, and then they put me on the desk. So I went from being nothing, never done TV before, to doing that, right? Mm-hmm. And so I can remember this. This is how it pertains to what we're talking about. So Nance tells me this. He says, look, I don't want to burst your bubble, but following George, no matter what you do, is going to look really good. And so following Matt and Joe Judge, whatever Billy O'Brien's do is going to look pretty good. Okay? I will take the same advice Nance gave me and apply it here. I mean, Billy's a professional. Billy's done this before. Billy knows how to do it, It's going
to be Bill Walsh's offense.
It's going to look – the players – here's what happens for any young coach listening to this podcast. God. When players ask you for an answer to a question and you don't provide it, you've lost the player. You've lost the player. I mean, Joe Judge is sitting there as the head coach of the New York Football Giants, and he didn't have an answer. I mean, if you're Joe Judge and you're watching the Giants win 9 games, win a playoff game with essentially the same roster, okay? Yeah. Essentially the same. Okay, Evan Neal's not the right tackle, but the line's playing at a higher level. The quarterback played at a higher level. Everybody did, right? You got to take responsibility for that, right? You got to say, hey, I didn't do a good job, because when the players went to you for an answer, they didn't have it. It's the same thing here. Like, the only way you get better as a coach is to accept responsibility. Like, and people say, well, you're really hard on coaches. I'm just being honest. I'm not being hard. Like, you got to accept responsibility. Matt Patricia's got to accept responsibility. Like, it wasn't like whenever I give a talk, I always talk about the Ohio State-Michigan game being sold out in the year 2050. Not because the kids are going to play in the game aren't even born yet. It's the uniforms they go to see. Like, don't make yourself bigger than what you are. That's what kills people. It's the Charlie Munger theory. When if you have 110 IQ and you act like you got 150, you're impossible. But if you have 110 IQ and act like you got an 80, you're going to be really great. And sometimes I think these coaches, when Joe took this, I think that's kind of the mindset. And I think that, look, this is the move they had to make. I mean, I've been saying it was as obvious. There's no way you can watch New England tape and say that was a well-constructed offense. You can blame Mac Jones, and I think that's fair. He certainly deserves some of the blame. But fundamentally, if you believe what I believe, which is players, coaches, and scheme, the coaching and scheme wasn't good enough. Now, who they hire as the line coach, I think, is going to be another critical hire.
It's something that's so true that you mentioned with the players. If you ask them the questions and you don't have the answers, you lose them. Because players, they talk about it all the time, and you'll hear these guys as analysts discuss it. They say, we can see through when the coach doesn't know what the hell they're doing. Like we can easily see through that because they know what it's supposed to look like. And if it doesn't look like something else, it's clear that it's like, all right, we're screwed. we have a guy that's clueless because we know the scheme more than he does. Now Oh, sorry. I wanted to ask you.
So let me explain that to
okay,
you.
Yeah, explain it. Yeah.
Go ahead.
No. Well,
you asked me the question. Go ahead.
Well, I wanted to ask you, though, because I'm sure there are some of the detractors out there that'll be like, well, here comes Belichick hiring another person from the New England scheme here and not really going outside for ideas. Do you put any stock into, all right, maybe this has kind of gotten a little stale, or is this really just that it needs to be this sort of a fit for them to have success?
I think what they'll do is figure out what they have. I think that there's certain coaches that are the great Bill Berman was telling me this the other day. He listened to our pod on Monday, and he's like, you know what it's like? He said it's like chefs and cooks, right? Mm-hmm. Certain guys are chefs, certain guys are cooks, right? And the cook can prepare the meal. The chef knows based on the recipe and has to do it that way. The chef, you can give him anything, and he can make something really good. I mean, Artie Bucco was a chef. You know, remember that scene where he's got, well, you didn't get to this episode, mm-hmm. but he's got the shit kicked out of him by Benny, and he's got his arm in a brace because Benny put his hand in the tomato sauce, and he's making rabbit based on what he has in the kitchen. You know, he's a chef. I mean, they can create something from what they have in the kitchen. Same thing with coaches. That's ultimately the way that you become a good coach is, what do I have? How do I make this work? And I think that's what Billy will do when he gets there, and it'll be kind of tied together. It'll be will it be elite? I don't know. You know, I don't think Alabama's offense was elite, but it's going to be better than what they had. And if the line coach is better and Billy's better, they're going to be better. There's no denying it. They're going to be no better. And so, but what happens is when you steal plays, when you sit there and borrow a play from a team, and you don't understand when the play breaks down what you need to do to fix the play, right? When you don't understand that, and then the players say, well, what happened? And you don't have an answer, you lose them. So Walsh hated play stealers. He hated it because he said that's why you can't steal the play. Because if you don't understand how the play breaks down, you're not going to be able to give the answer to the players.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that everything looks good on a chalkboard, but if you don't actually understand the concept behind the why and all that stuff, then it can easily come back.
The methodology is critical.
Yeah.
You got to understand the methodology. You know, you got to understand it. You got to know it. And if you don't, you look like the fool. And so you've got to be able to give answers. Like, I think that's going to be the big thing about the NFC Championship game is who's going to have answers.
It's a clear upgrade, in my opinion, there, going from OBrien to what they had last year with Joe Judge and the crew calling those plays.
See Jim Nantz quote.
Yes.
See Jim Nantz quote to Michael Lombardi.
That's an excellent story, by the way.
I learned so much on that show. I can remember one time I'm sitting there doing a segment, and I'm sitting there doing it, and I'm talking about all the GMs shuffling around in the NFL, and Nance grabs my arm, and I'll never forget it. Greatest advice I ever got in my life. He grabs my arm and says, Michael, let me tell you something. This shit is really, really important to you, and you love it, and I understand why. But the little old lady who's sitting in Des Moines, Iowa, watching the game and watching this show, she cares about three things: who the coach is, and who the quarterback is, and can her team win. She could give a shit about the GM. And she's right. And he's right. And ever since that day in 1998, when he told me that story, I've always believed the GM needs to stay in the background.
Thanks for watching the GM Shuffle with Michael Lombardi. And for more videos like this, make sure to subscribe to VSiN Live and the GM Shuffle podcast with Michael Lombardi, presented by DraftKings and VSiN, wherever you get your podcasts.